The Baltimore Ravens had a lot of successes during the 2023 season, but the way that their year ended makes the entire thing a massive failure. We talk about why and so much more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, coming to you from the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for being here, making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day, where free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes in video form on YouTube and audio form wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube if you're watching in video form. Hit that like button as well. It really helps out the channel. We're growing really fast on YouTube and obviously growing really fast in audio form as well. If you're listening today, wherever you're listening, your favorite podcasting platform, be sure to, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, follow along, and tell a friend, tell a family member that we have you covered 5 days a week, plus bonus content on Ravens coverage, so news, analysis, updates, and a lot more. You can follow me on Twitter at KaosStriker34. Also trying to start up my Instagram again, so we're building that back up. I wasn't on it for 6 months. I decided I wanted to start it up again, so it's the same handle, KaosStriker34, so you can follow me over there. I'd really appreciate that as well. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL and use code lowercase LockedOnNFL for a first deposit match up to $100. If you're listening to this, you probably know by now, right? The Ravens season ended not the way many wanted it to. AFC Championship game lost. We're now transitioning to the offseason period where the Ravens will have an opportunity to retool, and what that will look like, we're going to find out over the next couple of weeks, couple of months. In fact, we already found out a little bit, is the Ravens have lost some coaches. And I do want to just, it's continuing to wrap up the season almost, because I haven't had a chance to dive into this point yet on an episode because it's been so busy. So much stuff has happened. Obviously the championship loss. And then after that, it's been coaches leaving, coaches coming in, coaches being hired. And I haven't had the opportunity to talk about it. So I really wanted to get into just why the Ravens, even though they had so much success this year, there was so much good, why at the end of the day, the Ravens season was a massive failure, at least to me. I know everybody might not agree with that, but I'm going to air out why I think it was. And then it's not all going to be doom and gloom, though. So don't think it's going to be just doom and gloom all day today here on Locked On Ravens. In the second part of the show, we're going to get into their successes. And even in the first part of the show, we will too. But I want to get into what they can build on. What can they take from their year this year? And how can they build on it for 2024 and hopefully get further than they were at the end of their year this year? And then we'll get into Zach Orr's press conference. He talked on the lounge on Monday, but ended up getting his actual press conference in on Tuesday. Had a lot of interesting things to say, and I want to kind of talk about where I envision Zach Orr's strengths will be as a defensive coordinator, some things I'm a little worried about, and some more there. So it's another jam-packed episode here on the show today. Let's get into it. The Ravens had a lot of good this year. A lot of good happened for this team. I think when you talk about it, more good happened than bad, but the bad thing to me outweighs the good. Because in the NFL, as I've kind of talked about, and I've said this before, your goal is not to have regular season success. Obviously, it can be a goal, but it cannot be your main goal. Your main goal has to be to get to the Super Bowl and win the Super Bowl. And that's not going to happen every single season, right? We can be realistic about it. The Ravens, though, started off the year, and defensively, they were really sound for most, if not all of the year. Mike McDonald had that unit going. Obviously, guys like Roquan, Kyle Hamilton, et cetera, et cetera. But the offense took some time, right? It took some time to work up to speed. It was a new system. Guys were injured to start the season. Guys got injured at the beginning of the season. And you were kind of wondering, well, how is this going to look at the end of the season? Can they peak at the right time? And they were doing it. I mean, they got their guys back. They got reps together, and they were peaking at the right time. But then in the biggest moment of the year, the offense moved away from what their identity was. And we talked about John Harbaugh. We talked about Todd Monken. We talked about Lamar Jackson, who did not play a great game in that AFC Championship. And I think that's what makes it all the more disheartening for Ravens fans, right? As we watch this team all season long, really find their identity, find their stride. Defensively, they were awesome, and then they kind of crumble in the biggest game of the season. That's not to say there aren't things they can build on, which we'll again get to in the second part of the show. But when you talk about an overall goal, it is to win the Super Bowl, especially when you have a player like Lamar Jackson. When you build the roster around Lamar Jackson like that, when you have the coaching staff like that, it's what makes it all the more disappointing to me, right? And I don't want to necessarily harp on this for the rest of my life, right? It's going to be something I think about for a really, really long time. But again, at some point, we just have to say, dang, it stinks. It's a failure, 100%. But what can they do in 2024, which we'll, again, be working up to over the course of the rest of the week here on Locked On Ravens. And as we kind of move into the offseason portion of it, once the Super Bowl ends completely, and whoever wins between Kansas City and the 49ers, that'll be that. But for Baltimore, as I've said, if you're an everydayer with me here on Locked On Ravens, you have heard me say it. You're probably tired of me saying this by now. My expectation was the AFC Championship in terms of what it could be. It was AFC Championship game or bust. But I changed that. I changed it in the middle of the season to Super Bowl or bust, Super Bowl win or bust, because it was such a good opportunity for them. They had a top defense historically in the NFL in multiple different categories, metric-wise, advanced metrics. They were historic in multiple different aspects. Offensively, they hit their peak at the right time. We didn't want them. If you're the Ravens, you don't want to peak in November or October. You want to peak in the playoffs in January. We thought it had kind of come when the Texans' second half came around and they did their thing, but unfortunately, it didn't work out that way for them. And now we're just kind of stuck here wondering, well, what if they did what they did for all season? What if they ran the ball, et cetera, et cetera? And it's a really crummy feeling, in all honesty, because it just feels like that was the year. It felt like that was the team of destiny, but obviously it was not meant to be. And that's what makes it so disappointing. So that to me is why it is a failure, because Baltimore had, I think, the best opportunity in the Lamar Jackson era to win the Super Bowl. Talked all offseason about, hey, what if they do this right and they do that right and they, this goes their way, that goes their way. Health factor was huge. The Ravens dealt with injuries. I'm not saying they didn't. Obviously, you lost Marlon for a couple stints of an injury. Marcus Williams goes down. Ronnie Stanley, Tyler Linderbaum. You lose J.K. Dobbins, Keaton Mitchell for the year. Mark Andrews goes down, right? There were injuries throughout the season. But by the time they were in the AFC Championship game, they had everybody back except for Dobbins, Mitchell, and David Ajabo. Now, was Mark Andrews at 100%? No, he wasn't even close. Was Marlon Humphrey at 100%? No, he wasn't even close. So I'm not saying that injuries didn't impact the Ravens, even though those guys were not on injured reserve or out for the season, right? I'm not saying that. But considering where some other teams were in terms of health, who they played, Kansas City was down some guys, right? I mean, San Francisco's dealt with some stuff, and obviously talk about Detroit, they had some stuff throughout the season too. I mean, Baltimore was really healthy this year, all things considered. I mean, especially for what we saw over the past 4 years in Baltimore, it just felt like such a relief that they were that healthy. And I felt like, okay, after all that injury luck, after all those years of just being injury after injury after injury, finally they got the health, and that's what's going to be one of the things that takes them over the top. But they failed. They did. And we can talk about their successes. We can talk about what they did well, and we're going to get to it. But the end goal is to win a Super Bowl, especially with that team, with that coaching staff, with that roster. You had to take advantage of the Ravens. I'm not saying Baltimore can never get back, right? I'm not saying they can't get back next season. I'm not taking that approach because I don't believe in it. I think that Baltimore, as long as they have Lamar Jackson, they have a chance. But things do have to change. And I think it's even more disheartening that we kind of saw the same thing that we saw in 2019 just a round later, where the Ravens got punched in the mouth early and they felt like they had to get away from their identity. And essentially this year in particular played scared. I will say it. Baltimore played scared against Kansas City and thought it was going to be a shootout. They saw the Mahomes offense and company put up 2 touchdowns. They played the game like they were down 30. They were never down 10. And that's why, to me, you can live with a tough AFC Championship loss. Wouldn't have been great. The season was still have been a failure, right? You don't get to the Super Bowl with that team. You don't win with that team. You only get so many opportunities at that. And I think that's why you talk about teams like the Bengals back 2 years ago, the Eagles last year. Where are those two teams right now? The Bengals had a bunch of injuries. They missed the playoffs. And the Eagles were a disaster down the stretch. They were horrendous down the stretch. So it's not a guarantee. That's just a Super Bowl runner-up, right? I mean, you can understand, okay, it was Lamar's first AFC Championship game, and I think that plays a role, right? But I'm not saying Lamar was incredible in the championship game. He wasn't. He didn't play up the standard. But with all the success we saw, with all the feel-good stories we saw, with how much fun they were having, with how locked in they were, it's just so shocking to me that we're in this position. We're not talking about the Ravens in the Super Bowl, but you know what? The way they played, they didn't deserve to go. They didn't deserve to go with the way they played in that championship game, and we can look back on it. The Ravens can look at it as motivation, as a learning tool, but you only have so many opportunities to get to where you got. Only 4 teams make championship weekend. Only 2 make the Super Bowl. There's only 1 champion out of 32 teams. I'm not saying the Ravens are going to be the worst team in the NFL next year. I do not think they will. It's going to be very hard to do that unless they are just absolutely littered with injuries and it starts very early. Knock on wood, that does not happen. But Baltimore's season, because they did not win the Super Bowl with that group, I considered a failure. Does it mean there were no successes in there? No, there were plenty. Does it mean they can't take stuff away from it? No, you can take stuff away from it. But the end goal for a franchise like this that has such high expectations year in and year out, with the health they had, the successes they had, the dominance they had as well against top teams, the fact they didn't make the Super Bowl is a failure. That's what it is. So the Ravens had immense success in 2023, but their season to me was a massive failure. But coming up in the second part of the show, we will talk about what Baltimore can build on from their year and how they can apply that to 2024 to hopefully not repeat the same mistakes. So be sure to stay tuned. We got a lot to get to on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is brought to you by DoorDash, and I'm a big food guy. Whether I'm trying to get into a game day package like pizza, wings, sodas, burgers, even just buns, or whether I'm a big snack guy too. So the chips, the dips, nachos, everything you need to make your own nachos. DoorDash has everything for you. And with me being a food guy, DoorDash has helped me out a lot. You can trust me on that. And whenever I'm watching a game, if the game goes to a timeout, if it's halftime, if it's a 2-minute warning, I know that that's my cue to order in with DoorDash. Really, whenever the game clock stops, I know it's time to order in with DoorDash. And there's so many options here in the Baltimore area, whether you're looking at underground pizza or sushi, hana, depending on what type of food you like. DoorDash has it all for you. You can get 50% off of the $10 value when I spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app. Enter code LOCKED23. Separate exchange terms apply. Again, that's 50% off of the $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app. And enter code LOCKED23. Separate exchange terms apply. You can get prepared before game day too. Stock up on your favorite appetizers and order all your tailgate gear on DoorDash and get ready to watch your team win. Again, don't forget to use code LOCKED23 for 50% off the $10 value on your first order. You download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more. Separate exchange terms apply. And this show is brought to you by Prize Picks. If you're looking for daily fantasy sports, look no further than Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They're the easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. It's just you against the numbers. You pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 players, stat projections, and watch the winnings roll in. And we know the big games right around the corner. Prize Picks is the easiest, most exciting way to turn every game-changing moment into 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000. Of course, that expires post the big game. So Patrick Mahomes throws for more than 1 yard in the big game, you win over on Prize Picks. And Prize Picks is really, really simple to play. You can make your picks over there and submit your entry in less than 60 seconds. They have quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types. That's what makes Prize Picks a #1 daily fantasy sports app. So for me in this game, I think for Christian McCaffrey, I'm picking more on him. I think he's going to have more rushing yards than what Prize Picks has to offer. So I'm getting into that action over at Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use code LockedOnNFL for first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNFL. Use code LockedOnNFL for first deposit match up to $100. And don't forget, if Patrick Mahomes throws for more than 1 yard in the big game, you win on Prize Picks. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. We're back for our second segment, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Striker still talking with you here. Yes, I said it in the title of the show. The Ravens season, in my opinion, the fact they didn't win the Super Bowl, didn't even get there, makes it a massive failure. But that does not mean they cannot take things away. It does not mean that there were not successes in there that we can talk about. I mean, let's start with Lamar. Let's start with how good Lamar was this season. And let's just take the AFC Championship game out of it for a second. I mean, look, I know it's a part of the season for him, a part of his legacy, but Lamar's going to win the MVP here, and he deserves it. He was somebody that I thought showed a lot of leaps and bounds throughout the season. He can take stuff away from that. He can take stuff away from the championship game too. I thought that he was trying. I don't know if trying to do too much is the right term, but I don't think he necessarily took what the game was giving him the whole way. We saw Lamar take what the game was giving him a lot this season, and it worked out for him because we know how dynamic he is as a thrower and as a runner, how good of a quarterback he is. And it was such a joy to watch Lamar this season play. I mean, felt like he just had another gear and then another gear and then another gear. He just kept going up and up and up and up. And I think it all kind of came together for him after the bye week. The Rams, he had that what should have been a game-winning touchdown drive, but the Rams tied it up. The Ravens still won that game with Tylan Wallace. But then, dominates the Jaguars, dominates the 49ers, dominates the Dolphins. It was just such a fun stretch for him. And to be in control in that offense, to have the confidence of his offensive coordinator, for him to have confidence in his offensive coordinator, this was year one of Todd Monken. And I think we learned a lot. I think for Monken, sometimes he can also get too caught up in some stuff and not make the proper adjustments. And I think it was very hit or miss sometimes with Todd Monken, I think, where we saw a lot of games where he would just, Lions game, Seahawks game, some of those other games late in the season, just domination. And you look at other times and the Ravens really struggled for a half or struggled for 3 quarters, and it was a lot of 3 and outs. And so I think, look, as much as Lamar is learning the offense and figuring things out, Todd Monken was also learning his personnel for the entire season. And I'm hopeful, I would assume that the Ravens will be able, with Todd Monken, to come back better next season. Maybe a new running back tandem's in place. Justice Hill's here to stay. Keaton Mitchell comes back hopefully at some point next season. But does Derrick Henry come in? Do they re-sign J.K. Dobbins? Speaking of, it is February 7th today, 2/7. And I guess I'll throw that question out quickly. Do you think the Ravens should bring back J.K. Dobbins? You can comment down below on YouTube if you're there. You can tag me on Twitter. I put a post out on Twitter about it. So, even on Instagram, CalStriker34, I might put something out on that today here. But 2/7, February 7th with J.K. Dobbins, a really interesting storyline we'll talk about throughout the offseason. But to me, I think that a big part of this is just having the passing offense continue to grow. We know Zay Flowers is a dude. He's a dog, right? He is already wide receiver 1 material, and he's going to be one of the better receivers in this league for a long time. But then what do you do after that? I think we saw that the more weapons you surround Lamar Jackson with, the better he is. And look at that. Something we've been talking about here on this show for how many years now? We've been begging, just please surround him with weapons. Please surround Lamar with weapons. And, look what happens here. Does Odell come back? What do they do about Rashad Bateman's 5th-year option? Nelson Aguilar. That's all stuff that we can get into and talk about as the offseason comes. But we saw the deep ball was working at points for Lamar and Zay Flowers, but I think that's an area that Lamar can hopefully work on this offseason, is the consistency with the deep ball, because it worked at some points, but it just wasn't there for the majority of the season for him. And I think that really cost the Ravens in some key spots. I think also you saw 2 tight end sets. The Ravens can take what they saw from Isaiah Likely this year and really use him and Mark Andrews together and hopefully find a way to utilize both those guys on the field at the same time, because Isaiah Likely, his breakout was in full effect after Andrews went down. And then Andrews came back, and if everything felt a little rushed. Obviously, if Andrews can be out there, you want him out there, and he made a couple of key catches, but Likely was balling out, and you want to find, whether it's putting Likely out wide or using those guys in line together, you have to find a way to use both of them. Offensive line-wise, I think it was really up and down the whole year, honestly. Ronnie Stanley was not great for the majority of it. He kind of got it together a tiny bit as the season wound down and they started the rotation. But we can be honest, what you can take away from the offensive line is that, one, you can't have a long-term rotation at the tackle spots. You got to get guys in there you feel like can play a full season and won't get worn down towards the end. Does that mean you move on from Morgan Moses, save some money? Do you move on from Ronnie Stanley, save some money? Those are some things. Now, look, we know Tyler Linderbaum and Kevin Zeitler, they were those dudes on the interior, right? Linderbaum's going to be in Baltimore for a long time here, and Kevin Zeitler's a free agent, but I would expect him to come back. John Simpson played better than I thought he would, although I don't think he's necessarily a long-term option there at left guard. Had a bunch of penalties and, some very up and down play. But again, better than I thought he was going to be. But that's offensively, I think you can take away some positives, and with the inconsistency we saw, hopefully you come back with another full offseason of Todd Monken's system and it gets better. Defensively, it's obviously just going to be keeping the system. We'll talk about that with Zach Orr's press conference coming up here in just a minute in the third part of the show. But you still have Roquan Smith. You still have Kyle Hamilton. Still have Marlon Humphrey. You found a gem in Brandon Stevens, who personally I would be trying to get extended today, honestly yesterday. But to me, it's the system, right? Calculated aggressiveness, using guys off of the edge, bend, don't break defense. You can take some short stuff if you're an offense, take some intermediate stuff, but you're not going to beat this Ravens defense deep. The system has worked for them, and it'll have its twists and turns and some alterations, the Zach Orr alterations. But even though Mike McDonald leaves, and that's tough, if you keep the system and somebody who's Zach Orr has been working with Mike McDonald for a long time here and picking up everything and figuring things out, I think it'll be okay, even though the Ravens lost a bunch of coaches here. So coming up in the final part of the show, we will talk about Zach Orr in his press conference, some stuff he had to say to the media, a lot of interesting tidbits he had. So be sure to stay tuned. A lot to get to on Locked On Ravens. First, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and this next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. Sometimes you need an opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small, certain things can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. So today I want to say how I really feel about something. You might even be thinking the same thing this week, and I think you know exactly where I'm going with this one. The Ravens needed to run the ball more in the AFC Championship game. It's what got them there, and to have only 16 total carries, not, probably 11 or 12 design runs in there, plus 6 carries to running backs only. Just, it's not enough to get the job done. And against the Chiefs defense, against the run that was very porous for most of the season, really all the season, you can't have that happen in the biggest moment when the lights are the brightest. And it's a major, major reason why the Ravens lost this game. And therapy can be different for everybody. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team. And it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We're back here, our final segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still talking with you here on this midweek edition episode. Again, thanks so much for being here with me, making Locked On Ravens your first listen each and every day. Whether you are an everyday, you've been here with me every single day along the ride since you started tuning in. I really appreciate you. If you're new to the channel, welcome in. I would, again, appreciate if you like the content. Hopefully you do, hitting that like button, subscribing on YouTube as well. If you're in audio form, you can subscribe over there as well. And if you're somewhere in the middle, maybe you're not listening every single day, but you check in a couple times a week, couple times a month, really appreciate you as well. Again, we do 5 days a week Ravens content, even in the offseason. We're year-round here on Locked On Ravens. Every single weekday, I've not missed an episode of the show since I started back in August of 2019. Plus, we're starting to put out bonus content now. Again, I'm getting active on Instagram. Obviously, on Twitter, I've been there for 5 years and have built up a great following there, so really appreciate all that support as well. So be sure to check out everything I'm a part of. You're also started up on the Ryan Ripken show with Ryan Ripken, Cal Ripken Jr.'s son, where we're doing Ravens content over there. Also some Orioles. So if you're a Baltimore sports fan, you're excited about the Orioles. They just got Corbin Burns, new ownership. You can head over there and check me out, plus all of our team out over there too. Let's talk about Zach Orr a little bit, because it's an exciting hire. Obviously comes on the heels of a not so exciting move with Mike Macdonald leaving the Ravens, going to Seattle as their head coach. We talked about that. We've really not stopped talking about it here on the show. But Zach Orr had his press conference on Tuesday, had a lot of very interesting tidbits. And first of all, I was just really excited for the opportunity. Said that he's ready to get to work and it's a blessing. And really it reaffirmed what everybody already knew about him, which is he loves this organization. He loves this city. Said that he bleeds purple and black. And that, to me, it's, his journey, right? His journey is he was a 3-year player with the Ravens. His last year, he was a second-team All-Pro. I mean, was really on the road to absolute stardom. Was already honestly, pretty much on that stardom level, but ended up having an injury that he had to end his career with. And instead of putting his head down, well, he credited the Ravens and Ozzie and all these guys, Ozzie Newsome, for preventing him from putting his head down. And he was in the coaching world for them and also in the front office scouting role for a little bit when he just was trying to decide what path he wanted to take post-playing career. And that helped him kind of shape who he is today. But he did say that the interview process for this, he had talked with John Harbaugh on Monday and Tuesday about the role. On Wednesday, he got offered, and he said that, he accepted it. But he said that he started talking to John Harbaugh with that Monday because it got pretty evident that, hey, you know what, Mike Macdonald might be leaving and Ravens might need somebody. And that's why it was so imperative for them to get somebody quickly, because as Zach Orr said on the Lounge podcast on Monday, Mike Macdonald wanted him in Seattle. And Zach Orr loves the organization. He said it would have taken a lot to get him out of the door of the Ravens and to go to another opportunity. But the Ravens had to move quickly on this because they had so many good coaches, and obviously not all of them left. They still have guys like Chuck Smith, Chris Hewitt, et cetera. The list goes on. Obviously, Orr is there too. But in terms of defensive coordinator, guys who were drawing interest as defensive coordinators, Baltimore had to offer one of them because they were getting offers elsewhere. And I think, this is not confirmed or anything. It's just speculation on my part. I think they had to essentially choose between Anthony Weaver and Zach Orr. And, if you want to throw Denard Wilson in there, you can. But they essentially had to choose between those 2 or 3 guys. and the 2 or 1 that they didn't choose, they were leaving, because Denard Wilson had multiple interviews and a couple offers, I believe. Weaver obviously was in the Commanders head coaching mix, and then had a couple other defensive coordinator opportunities. He could have followed McDonald to Seattle if he didn't get the Dolphins job. Then you have Zach Orr, who would have probably followed McDonald to Seattle if the Ravens didn't offer him that coordinator job. So the Ravens chose Orr, kind of the same path as McDonald, a young up-and-coming coordinator, or I guess a coach who is now a coordinator. And the difference, I guess, is McDonald had the play calling experience in Michigan before coming over. Zach Orr has none, so there are going to be some learning curves with that. And John Harbaugh acknowledged as such during his end-of-season press conference. But Orr said he didn't really have a chance to process what happened the day before with them losing in the AFC Championship. But the quote that's getting everybody, my favorite quote and my favorite answer from Zach Orr in this whole entire thing, was that he said that he's going to be calling plays from the field. And he said, I got to be on the field. I got to look at these players in the eyes. And I love that. I don't have a problem with people calling plays in the booth, right? I don't have a problem with it. But I do think that there is an extra element to being on the field. And Zach Orr was on the field with those guys. And look, he was a player, right? I think he wants to be there. And that's kind of like where he feels at home, where it feels natural for him. He's hyping up the guys, getting in their face and being excited with them. And, you can criticize there too. It's both ways. But I think just going through the motion, that's what he kind of talked about, right? Feeling what's going on, how they're feeling in the game. You can get a better feel of that on the field. And I think that is 100% true. Now, we also talked about getting some more coaches in the organization right now. The Ravens lost a plethora of them, as we talked about. So he's working right now to get some guys in. Now, speaking of which, with a side tangent quickly, apparently Jerry Rosburg is not coming to Baltimore. We had a whole segment on it yesterday, and all for nothing. You can go back and listen to my thoughts on it if you want a good laugh, because it's not happening. But Rosburg is apparently not coming, whether that was a money issue or whether it was a role issue. Rosburg had second thoughts. Kind of a weird situation. I don't really know what that was. I mean, I didn't hate the idea of bringing him in. I thought it was a fine hire, but it's no longer happening apparently. So we'll see what happens. But yeah, I think Orr had a lot of great answers when talking about this new opportunity for him. I'm really excited for him to get this chance, right? His playing career was cut short. And now this is he's 31 years old. You're right. McDonald was the youngest. Well, he is now the youngest head coach in the league. A lot of people maybe view Zach Orr, if he has a couple years more of experience, he maybe could be a head coach candidate. Maybe he's the successor to John Harbaugh. Who knows? But I'm excited for Orr in this defense. I think you keep the system, right? And we're kind of talking about it, right? Some of the stuff from McDonald is going to stay and be there. So just like with McDonald, some stuff from Martindale stayed. With Martindale, some stuff with Dean Pease stayed. So there is that element to it, but at the same time, we're going to get some Zach Orr twists on it. And he said, physical, violent. The teams are going to know when they hit and the Ravens hit. Those are things that it's stuff that Mike McDonald had, but Zach Orr is going to bring up that intensity level. Not that McDonald didn't have it, but Zach Orr is going to bring up that intensity level by a very, very wide margin. But that's all I have here today on Locked On Ravens. Thanks so much for tuning in, and be sure to subscribe here on YouTube, subscribe here in audio form as well, wherever you're watching or listening. I really appreciate you. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, on Instagram as well, at ChaosStriker34, trying to build that back up. Coming up tomorrow, more Ravens content. Stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.